Hello, and welcome to Easterseals DuPage and Fox Valley's IEP webinar series. This is part one of a two-part series reviewing the IEP process. You will be hearing from myself, Care Coordinator Anne-Marie LeCompte, and my colleague Michael Krupka, Community Marketing Coordinator. Here at Easterseals DuPage, every child deserves to thrive in an inclusive community. Easterseals DuPage and Fox Valley provides comprehensive pediatric outpatient rehabilitation services to more than 1,000 infants and children with developmental delays and disabilities every week. Our main mission is to ensure that children with disabilities and their families are empowered. And that's where we start today, with learning the IEP. Again, introducing myself, I am Anne-Marie LeCompte, Care Coordinator for Easterseals DuPage and Fox Valley. I provide support to families during transitional periods from admission to discharge, help families understand their priorities, identify needs, and empower families to obtain resources that best meet the needs of their child. As part of the expanding mental health and family support services team, 9 people and growing, my job is to provide families with the tools they need to help their child thrive, which includes understanding school-based, individualized education plans at their most basic level. We all have to start somewhere. These are the questions we hope to answer during our time here today and next week, as this is a two-part series. Today we will start with understanding what the IEP is, and we will end today's presentation with understanding the caregiver role, your role.
What happens? What do I do if an evaluation signals a developmental delay or a need for further evaluation for my child? Well, starting at the beginning, before an IEP plan is in place, there are evaluations that are conducted to measure the skills and strengths of your child. Once those evaluations have concluded, and depending on the results, the school district determines eligibility for an IEP at a meeting where the team provides their recommendations and how to achieve the best educational outcomes for your child. As a caregiver or guardian of a child in the IEP process, your job, what you can do, is hold the school accountable to the goals written and outlined in the IEP.
To start, let's normalize the IEP. You might be asking yourself, I'm worried my child will be labeled and excluded. Why would an IEP be beneficial? In 2021, the number of students aged 3 to 21 who received special education services under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, also known as IDEA, was 7.2 million, or 15% of all public school students. That's a pretty large percentage. IEPs are a way to promote inclusion, make the most out of the educational experience, and have a tailored education plan for a child to reach their full potential. And IEPs also have the added benefit of having a dedicated team of educators and therapists. Think about it like this. An IEP is to a child as the right tool is to building an IKEA bookshelf. Without the proper tool and directions, there's going to be a lot of frustration, more questions and answers, and probably not a lot of progress. But once we have that tool, the bookshelf is built in no time. You might even think, how did I go so long without this tool? The same is true for a child who requires an IEP. It's sometimes the missing tool to build something great.
I am not comfortable with my child being labeled as having a disability. Well, an IEP does not create or label nor provide a diagnosis of a disability. To be eligible for special education, there must be an adverse effect on educational performance, and it must require specialized services. IDEA recognizes disabilities such as autism, developmental delays, and speech or language impairment that would qualify a student for an IEP. In the school setting, IEP information is never shared with other students and is not used as an identifier for who the child is. To dispel any fear or stigma around labels, it's helpful to remember that anyone with a different ability is a person first. For example, they have autism, demonstrates that there is more to a person and gives ownership of other attributes versus they are autistic, which gives them only one identifier, a label. Using the same application for a child helps that child and their peers understand that they are more than just a diagnosis or a limitation, and focuses more on what they can do.
How did IEPs become so important to education? What is FAPE? Great questions. Free and appropriate public education is the foundation for special education and required by IDEA. IEPs are legally binding documents under federal law. No state can perform under the federally required policies, but they can always go above and beyond. FAPE also means that special education services are provided at public expense. Taxes, funding by local and federal governments, and at public supervision and direction. Think referendums when you vote. Responsibilities under FAPE include Child Find 2. Child Find means identifying, locating, evaluating all children in the state, even private schools, with a disability. FAPE provides a preschool, elementary, and secondary education in the state. And they're always in conformity with the IEP program standards. These responsibilities make it possible for children with different abilities, regardless of their situation, access to specialized education.
How does the school prove that they are following and meeting the IEP goals? The answer is accountability. Accountability is crucial to your child making progress in an educational setting. FAPE and IDEA protocols have strict rules that school districts must follow. On this slide, you'll see bolded text that introduces the minimally required components of an IEP, such as a statement of the student's present levels of academic achievement and how the student's disabilities affect students' involvement in education. A statement of measurable annual goals, for example, a child will initiate play with peers by this date, and how they will be measured. Statement of special education and related services like supplementary aids and services, program modification statements, how and when the student will participate with or without other students, any appropriate accommodations that are necessary or busing, and a projected start and finish date. These can also be found in more detail on the ISB website as they are part of the definition of individualized education.
How does free and appropriate public education work for me? How does it work for you? Continuing our conversation from previous slides about how FAPE and IDEA work together to support special education, IEPs are individualized for one student and are unique to them. In order for the IEPs to be considered educationally beneficial, IEPs must follow these 8 steps. Number 1, most importantly, adhere to IDEA's procedures because it's federally required. 2, ensure caregiver involvement, meaningful and dedicated participation, doing whatever it takes to get the student's caregiver involved. Number 3, assessments that address all of the student's needs. That means starting at academic and even mentioning special needs transportation. Number 4, develop ambitious and measurable IEP goals, meaning that we're working towards something. We're not just maintaining the status quo. Number 5, peer-reviewed research supporting programming to help student make progress in light of the circumstances. So evidence-based practices. We're not experimenting with any child's education. Number 6 and 7 go together. Monitoring progress and report to parents. Also, if data demonstrates that there's no progress, then we're making instructional changes with the parent or with the caregiver's input, your input. And finally, number 8, defend how the student's IEP will enable them to make progress. How's the IEP going to work? Why are we having this discussion about needing an individualized education plan?
IEPs are legally binding documents for school districts. Implementation of these documents are mandatory, not discretionary, nor optional.
An IEP meeting seems like a lot of parts. It is. But what can you expect for it to be at its core? Great question. There are 2 main parts. First, it's determining eligibility. Everyone involved in evaluating your child will attend or send a report, and they will provide copies of the evaluations at least 3 days prior to the meeting. Sometimes it's more, which is great, but expect it to be 3. When you receive the evaluations and report, review them, take notes, ask questions on the topics that you have them. And if it's determined that your student has a disability under IDEA and is eligible for special education services, you will move on to developing the actual IEP with goals, objectives, and educational placement.
Work with and be a player on your team. During the IEP discussion about goals, objectives, and educational placement, it's best to think of yourself as a teammate, and in order to win, collaboration is the key. Communication is a driving factor in achieving the desired or planned results for a student. Being good team members also means that school and caregivers participate and understand the regulations guiding the process, and that they are efficient and timely in addressing students' progress or concerns, and also allowing space for the school to share data and information to support pending or planned changes to a child's programming. These key elements are best implemented when they are reciprocated because it ensures that the student is the main priority, that there is respect and procedure. This IEP will follow your student, and developing a working relationship with the IEP team now sets everyone else up for success and better developed IEPs in the future.
Now that we reviewed being a team player, we need to know what it takes to be the individual contributor to the whole team. What's my role? What's your role in the IEP process? Do you get a say in what happens before, during, and after? The short answer, yes. But it does take some accountability. The best part of the IEP is that you, the person who knows your child best, has a conductor seat, which is so rare in life. There are procedural events that occur, but there are also things that you can do to support the process and truly make you feel like you are part of the time, such as holding yourself and school accountable by checking the date, time, place of the IEP, contacting school with new information, bringing your partner if possible, identifying your strengths, make a list of questions, tour the school and learning environment, and most importantly, through all of this accountability, remember that every IEP experience is unique because your child is unique. That also brings up the point that you may want to consider bringing your child only during transition times, like middle school and high school, to create that autonomy. However, if it can be avoided, don't bring small children to IEP meetings because you want your chance to participate to be maxed.
Should I be thinking about my child's behaviors and how our history could help create the best IEP outcomes? Absolutely. You are the expert on your student, Because you are the expert, you are the leading resource that can support the school personnel. It is beneficial to note that since all of us digest information at a different pace, and meetings may not be the most comfortable space for a parent to be an active participant, ask the team to allow you to consider the information presented and that you respond back to them with questions or concerns within a few days.
You might be saying to yourself, great, I have all of this knowledge and the history of our family is so important and my child. And great, we even have a prescription from the doctor saying that we need to get an IEP. So is an IEP guaranteed if the information comes from the doctor? Well, put it this way. Schools can always appreciate that families seek support from trusted professionals. That goes without saying. And they're probably thankful for it. But if a physician's diagnosis and input about a child's medical condition is important and does bear on the IEP's team's informed determination, however, a physician and therapist cannot make recommendations. Instead, they make suggestions. A physician does not prescribe an IEP or services, but the student's IEP team determines eligibility for services.
What is an actual meeting like? How do I know that I am attending an IEP meeting? Well, your school will schedule a date to have you, the school team, supportive instructors, and any additional support that you may need. The school will use the formal term staffing to signify that this is an IEP meeting, and its purpose is to process information collected throughout the interactions with your child. Some of the supportive resources you can bring with you include a partner, a parent liaison, a friend, a relative, or outside therapist. It's helpful to let the school know how many people will be in attendance to reduce intimidation to the school team, increase awareness of who exactly will be at the meeting, and to prepare for all needed accommodations of every attendee. At the staffing, the school personnel will discuss your child's strengths and weaknesses and detail their findings for the report. It's important to understand that schools are obligated to consider, discuss, and review outside evaluations, but legally, they can base their decisions solely on information that the school-based team has gathered.
So after reviewing your portion and what it takes to know that you're actually in an IEP meeting, like the vocabulary words used, let's review what happens at the IEP meeting. Things that you can check off and know that if these things happened, I would know I'm at an IEP meeting and not just a discussion. Throughout this presentation, you've had some foundational knowledge about the IEP origins and have hopefully accessed the safeguards and protections of the IEP. But now let's get into what happens at the IEP when you're looking at it from the inside and actually experiencing it. So at this point, it means that your child and your student is eligible for special education, and they will present specified criteria if there is a distinct disability that is covered under special education regulations. The IEP meeting document will be in draft form, which is great. That means goals and objectives are malleable. They can be changed, which means you are still very much a part of this process. Some special education choices may be limited due to stage of life, such as early childhood. However, sharing information, ideas, concerns is always welcomed. You are entitled to an explanation of the choices made, too. This point in the meeting, also, placement becomes formalized.
The outline shown here is a simple summary of what the IEP might look like at the end of the meeting. These areas of need will be discussed and addressed at length, but they do not always look so clean or formatted in a bullet point fashion. It is completely okay if you feel confused or if you feel that points were missed. Ask to review these topics again for your understanding. There's nothing wrong with that. It's extremely important that everyone, including yourself, has a complete understanding of how the student will be supported to reach their goals. Once the IEP team has reviewed and processed the needs, objectives, and goals, and you have completed the IEP document, you have 10 days to review and sign it before its placement. You do not have to sign before leaving the meeting. Take the time you need to digest and understand everything. However, if at the end of the meeting, if you're in total agreement and you're comfortable with what has been written in the IEP, feel free to sign it right then.
This seems to be a lot going on in a short amount of time. Are you talking about this webinar, or are we talking about the actual IEP? Probably both. You might be asking, are there any breaks? Well, for the IEP, you are in control. IEPs can seem like an information overload because they are. They involve a lot of decisions, procedures that school is legally required to implement, and don't forget, there are a lot of emotions to process. It would be perfectly normal to experience fatigue. This is where we love to promote the skill of flexing your advocacy muscle. Ask the questions, request that conversation slow down. Take a moment to process and remember that you and school are in this together. A team leaves no person behind.
Who is required to attend a school IEP meeting? When sitting down at the table for the IEP meeting, you will most likely see some familiar faces, as well as people that you are meeting for the first time. Everyone in attendance is there to create the best environment for your child and their educational goals. Before the meeting starts, it's a great practice for the team to introduce themselves and what role they play in your child's educational life. It's important for you to note your IEP teammates so you know who can answer specific questions later. While there may be many people at the meeting, these three have to be there. A regular education teacher who is responsible for implementing the portion of the IEP if the student is participating in a regular education environment. A special education teacher or interventionist, a speech language, occupation, or physical therapist, who would be responsible for implementing the portion of the IEP dedicated to the child's required special needs. And an LEA, or local education agency representative. This person is a qualified individual that is at the meeting to provide or supervise the provision of specially designed instruction set to meet the needs of children with disabilities. They have complete knowledge of all district resources, they will make commitments for the provision of resources, and they will ensure that the IEP is properly detailed and implemented.
Now, I know you see those words at the top of the screen and you say, who else is required to attend a school IEP meeting? Yes, there are a lot of people. Additionally, your IEP team will have an individual who is qualified to interpret the instructional implications and other professionals who have expertise or knowledge regarding the child, and others that you, the student's caregiver, can choose to have there too, like representatives, therapists, consulting evaluators, or private programming individuals. The most important person or individuals that are there, however, is you. The school must ensure that they take whatever action necessary to have the parent participate and understand the proceedings. Parents, caregivers, you are the driving force of getting their student the support they need to reach their fullest potential. Flex that advocacy muscle and let school support you in what you need to be present and in decision-making mode. Pretty heavy start in this webinar, and you're already thinking, let's slow down here. The same is probably true for the IEP process. So it's important that we review the considerations of the IEP, since it's helpful to remember that procedure, prior knowledge, and expectations will help you navigate decision making and understand accountability. These considerations that are listed on this slide will help develop the goals and objectives of the IEP. So the student strengths, for example, makes friends fast, perseveres, is funny, kind, exceptional reader, those kind of strengths. Number two, concerns of the parents for enhancing education, like needing additional support or wanting more service time in a specific area, like PT or OT. Number three, results of the most recent evaluation. If there was an evaluation, for example, autism, or if there was a PT and OT, those would help too. Number four, the academic, developmental, and functional needs of the student as well.
Additionally, and probably most importantly, the IEP must include your child's present level of academic achievement and functional performance, which, in long and short, means performance in areas relating to school subjects, math, reading, science, etc., areas of socialization that are not academic related, independent living, orientation, and mobility, and how the delay or delays will affect your child's involvement and progress in the general education curriculum.
When we talk about considerations, we are also addressing the information that will relate to the measurable goals that the state of Illinois has for learning standards, as well as the Common Core standards. And then most importantly, we also have goals that are specific to your student, right? That's what the IEP stands for, both academically and functionally. Goals should be and will be presented in the SMART format, which helps identify the who, what, when, where, and how of the IEP. So strategic, S, measurable, M, attainable, A, realistic, R, and then T for time bound. Goals also address other educational needs that are attached to the student's disability. They have benchmarks, which are the smaller goals. And then as an accountability feature, IEPs must include progress monitoring. Progress monitoring means that there will be a periodic report of where the student is at now compared to where the student's goal says it will be at a later point in time.
So while we're on the topic of goal setting, you might be thinking, should my child's IEP goals change every year, or should they remain the same? Well, because goals are intended to be reached, they are always updated yearly. Sometimes the goals are extended, altered, or terminated. In some cases, the goals may not have been met, so the team will discuss the need to address the instructional practices, the objectives, the measurement process, or other factors to create a goal which is valid and obtainable. Goals are also related to transition points in public schools. IEPs will require significant changes during these times, as they are pivotal in what a student's academic and functional goals are. We want students and their team to be working towards something like in the transitions from early childhood to elementary, elementary to middle school to high school, and transition planning from 14 and up.
So to reach those goals, right, even in those transition periods of time, the IEP includes special education and supplementary aids and services, which are peer-reviewed, meaning evidence-based, right? Again, from part one, we talked about there's no experimental interventions going on. Aids and supports are reported on because, right, they're evidence-based, and it describes modifications that will enable each student to advance appropriately. Again, we're talking about working towards something. Maintaining the status quo is boring and rightfully not for the benefit of the child. Making progress in the general education curriculum, like participating in non-academic or extracurriculars. Being educated with other students, their peers, right? We're talking about inclusion. And then Finally, access to related services, beginning with transportation, all the way to parent counseling and training. And then, as you'll see here on this slide, almost everything in between. It's not listed here. Again, enter it into the chat and we can talk about that at a later point in time.
So is adaptive equipment or devices something that are included in an IEP? Yes. Opening up our conversation to specific supplementary aids and related services, yes, adaptive equipment and devices are included in the IEP. As we have consistently stated here today and last week, the IEP is meant to serve as access to an educational environment in whatever capacity that is indicated by a student's different ability. This point is worth restating because supportive services are required to assist a child with a disability so that students can benefit from special education. This is one of the foundational concepts of FAPE and IDEA, the standards and procedures that are federally required.
I know that an IEP addresses my child's educational goals, but how can they help with other skills that they need help with? What if my child receives outside services, private therapy services? How does this affect the IEP process? Great question, right? Because if you're identifying a need, you're probably, hopefully, servicing it elsewhere, right? Well, IEP-related instruction services are in place to support educational goals, which means goals that help them access the same academic environment as their peers. This difference drives a lot of discussion and advocacy for caregivers because the educational goals and related services feels like school has limitations if they're not meeting those standards that you require. It's helpful to consider that school, a different environment than home or play, is going to access different professionals, different equipment, different therapeutic models as well. Or they might not have access to services at all, which is unfortunate, but it's not for lack of trying. Districts are responsible, though, for providing a research-based system of instruction and intervention, which is good news. It may not be the exact same as your family received privately, but is always research-based. Nothing is experimental. An ideal way to blend the benefits and reach educational and global goals is to consider maintaining outside services once school-based services have begun. Getting a release of information signed for school and private therapists to communicate enhances collaboration about progress and information, and it helps for the well-being of the student.
So you might be asking yourself, can Easterseals DuPage help with the school IEP process and the other therapies that our child might need but are not covered in the IEP? Yes, Easterseals can help parents understand the IEP process and how to get their best outcome. Easterseals therapists can then build a comprehensive plan to fulfill any needs that fall outside of the scope of the IEP, such as functional goals that are most important for families to improve, like swallowing, oral motor skills, nutrition, independent hygiene, and more are not deemed as educational needs, and therefore they are unable to include them in the IEP. Co-treat sessions with multiple disciplines, such as physical therapy supporting speech with position and voice, are also not included, but are necessary to allowing that child to be most effective in their IEP. Remember that schools assess a children's need in order to achieve success in an educational environment only. While that can include daily living and more functional skills, that is not typically the focus of school-based services and not daily living skills. We consult and involve all medical professionals and school therapists to achieve maximal outcomes. We're all on the same team to help your child live their best life.
So we've talked about all these supplementary aids and services, how Easterseals can help, and those key players. But you may have also heard that there is a paraprofessional on your IEP team, or the option for that. What is it and what do they do? When we talk about paraprofessional, or para, shortened version, is they are an employee of the district who is assigned to assist students with tasks that they are unable to complete on their own. It can be one-on-one based. However, that has to do with intensity and severity. Remember, we are in a least restrictive environment. It can be in a special education classroom or a general education setting to support other students with disabilities. Paraprofessionals are not typically licensed teachers, but regardless of their background, they still provide functions that help the students, and they function under the supervision of a licensed staff member.
A common stress or worry about special education is the question, will my child be excluded from the normal classroom environment? And how could it be more inclusive? Well, kids are either served in a general education environment for all or part of their day. When they are not in a specialized environment, they are in general education. A student who spends a majority of their day, or all of it in extreme cases, is said to be at an instructional level or being educated within a self-contained setting. All special education services are first looked at in how can this be provided in a general education setting in an inclusive environment. Self-contained classrooms will all have students with an IEP. In early childhood, a classroom that serves a majority of students with disabilities who have IEPs would also be considered a self-contained environment. General education classroom is a traditional classroom that is blended with students with IEPs and students without IEPs.
So now we're talking about the inclusive classroom. Well, inclusive environments are pretty inherent in public schools, given that a typical general education classroom is an inclusive classroom, right? We have children with IEPs and children without IEPs in one room. Another point to belabor, however, is that schools are required to place child in the least restrictive environment. That means the least amount of support for a child to be successful. We are trying to curate that independence. So you're looking at independence, or from least to most. You have to start somewhere. This can be a difficult concept to apply to your student when you believe that they should have all the supports, right? But it's helpful to think about this analogy. It's one of my favorite. So let's say we go to the doctor because we are sure this sore throat and runny nose is something more than allergies, living in Chicago, right? We get to the doctor and they confirm, yes, looks like a catchy cold. Go home, get some rest, drink lots of fluids. The next week, you are back because the same symptoms are there, but now they're a little more than before. Sore throat, runny nose, bad cough. The doctor investigates and says, you're right, we need a little more because the first thing just didn't work. Let's put you on a Z-Pack. Take as directed. Well, you do as the doc says, and within 2 weeks, you're back because now you have a heavy chest, a headache, phlegmy cough, sniffles, and chills. This time, the doctor says, oh, goodness, looks like we have pneumonia. Let's get you on something stronger. A doctor never assumes the worst because they know that they would exhaust a lot of resources quickly on the first hand, and it would put a lot of stress on the patient and worry too. So it's easier to go from least to most than most to least. The same is true for IEP inclusion and services.
So this is obviously a big concern of all parents. But a school district must ensure to the maximum extent appropriate that children with disabilities are educated with children who are non-disabled and their peer group. Special classes, separate schooling, or other removal of students with disabilities from their regular educational environment occurs only when the nature or severity of the disability of a child is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily.
And so we're talking about all these great ideas and having accountability and expectations, right? But what happens if you really don't agree with the school or the process seemed below your standards? At the end of the staffing, you will receive a copy of your IEP along with a copy of the educational rights of students with disabilities in a condensed form. A full version of the educational rights is available on the Illinois State Board of Education's website, and we highly recommend accessing it for your own knowledge about the process. IEPs, it's important to know that IEPs are legally binding documents, and implementation of these documents is not suggested, it's mandatory. If by chance there is a dispute about the process, services, placement, IEP team members, you would file a written complaint, which leads us to talk about the process to ensuring accountability.
So I've heard about due process. What is due process? Should I seek due process? Due process is a dispute resolution procedure under IDEA for a dispute regarding special education. We still stand by that you and the school are on this journey together, and holding each other accountable is important for a successful future for your child. Just like our least to most ideals, writing a formal complaint leads to a resolution session or mediation where both sides try to reach an agreement before going further with a legal proceeding of due process, which can be long and arduous.
And I think we can all agree that anything more than mediation would be unwanted. However, and unfortunately, there can be times when a complaint is warranted that is related to the identification, evaluation, or educational placement of a child with a disability, or the provision of a free and appropriate public education. So you might say, when do I ask for due process? Well, if you disagree, like we had previously stated, you would write a formal complaint. When you are in due process, it is a formal proceeding. That means there is evidence presented and witnesses speak in front of a hearing officer who acts as a judge. So the judge or the hearing officer then decides the case based on state and federal regulations. Remember, IEPs are legally binding documents, and they are federal procedures and processes that support all of things that you are afforded as a caregiver of a student with an IEP. And then in this process that seems like a lot, because it is, you can seek out legal counsel. If you don't feel comfortable with that, you can also seek this out independently, which is a benefit if you feel that strongly.
So I know that this is a long and controversial process, and you may be asking yourself whether or not you're going to require legal representation and what lawyers do this kind of work. So there's no short answer. IEPs are not meant to be intimidating. I think that we've covered that already. You know, we want the parents, it's important that the parents are a part of the team to frame the best IEP possible. It is in the school's best interest to make you as comfortable with the IEP process, and that's of utmost importance for your student. However, legal representation or educational advocates can help by providing a more thorough understanding of the IEP process and its intents, and help you better navigate some of your questions or be able to help frame them. Building the advocacy muscle is tough work, but once you have the foundational knowledge, access appropriate information, and ask questions, flexing that muscle becomes easy, and you can identify when the school district is not responding or communicating effectively regarding your students' educational programming. If you feel you need an additional team member, seeking professional support like a legal advocate might be the right move to make.
When we talk about being an advocate, flexing that muscle, and accessing accountability procedures, We also talk about being self-advocates and taking on our own responsibility to support our own students when they can't. This may mean monitoring the IEP process by connecting with teachers before the IEP and after, right, to check in and collaborate on goals, how best to support your student outside of the educational environment. Maybe it's advocating for a communication notebook, right? So you know what's going on and what the teacher and yourself can expect from day to day. It's also asking for IEP meetings when you feel changes are needed and being aware that there are procedures, right? Every 3 years, your child is going to be really evaluated. That's a normal standard and that's okay. But monitoring it and knowing that is your greatest tool. If you need anything sooner, also, you know that you make a request in writing.
So what questions should I ask my IEP team? There are no wrong questions to ask. You are the best chance to have your student access their best educational support as part of a team member for your IEP. And it's important to ask questions even if you feel they've already been answered. You're entitled to thorough and thoughtful answers, and as many of them as you need answered. Some of the questions you might ask: what happens if I decline a certain area of services? Does this placement meet least restrictive environment goals, and how? How can I support these goals at home? How will you collaborate with my student's private therapy team? These are all things that are going to help build a strong IEP and ensure that you're doing the most to assist your IEP team.
So as we ended the part 1 of our webinar series, this is kind of how we end part 2 as well, right? You are the strong force and you are the one advocating for your student and asking the questions and asking for, defining what this educational process looks like for your student too. So here are some helpful resources that we have to provide information, access, and tools for the IEP process, disability services, advocacy, and helping children reach their overall fullest potential. This list is not exhaustive, and there are more resources that can be found. And you can do that by reaching me, Anne Marie, the care coordinator. My information will be provided shortly. But again, you have this unique position where you can support your child by knowing all these things. It's a lot of information, and knowing what you're entitled to is so important.
So IEPs, I think we've covered, are very specifically tailored to a child's needs, and can vary depending on what needs the child has. And so we've been very general and broad in this presentation to just discuss the IEP as a tool and how it's constructed. It's no different if a child is medically fragile or has different special needs or is not at a traditional school. The IEP process is the same, and they would address that child's medical needs accordingly. For specific questions and components of IEPs that are related to autism, cerebral palsy, medically fragile students, there will be specific components that can vary significantly and processed with our team at Easterseals DuPage based on their specialty, which also may include paying attention, working around a child's allergy, diet, their behavior, structure, and eating, etc. So again, we'll continue to support you and your child in their in all of their therapy goals not related to their educational goals.
So that concludes our webinar series on the IEP overview. Thank you all for participating today. Thank you to my colleagues Erin and Michael for helping moderate and present. If you were unable to get specific questions answered in today's webinar, please direct additional inquiries to me, Anne-Marie Lecomte, your coordinator. Again, I will gladly provide support and information and find resources for you in all your IEP related inquiries and others. Thank you again. We hope this was helpful, and have a wonderful afternoon.